I kissed him first. That's the part I can never explain away. No matter how many times I've tried to reframe it in my head, it wasn't an accident in the way you bump into someone on the subway or spill coffee on a stranger's laptop. I leaned in. I closed my eyes. I kissed him, and for one breath, maybe two, it felt like the most natural thing I had ever done. The problem was, I was kissing the wrong man, and the wrong man didn't stop me. My name is Iris Calloway, and I grew up in a 3-bedroom house in Canada, the kind of Ottawa suburb where everyone mows their lawn on Saturday morning and waves to each other across the driveway. My parents were teachers. We ate dinner together almost every night. I did my homework at the kitchen table while my mom graded papers beside me, her red pen moving steadily across pages while the radio played CBC softly in the background. I tell you this because I want you to understand that nothing in my upbringing prepared me for the Voss family. I met Owen Voss on a Tuesday in February, which is, honestly, the least romantic possible setting for a love story. We were both waiting for the same delayed Via Rail train at Ottawa Station, him in a charcoal wool coat that probably cost more than my monthly rent, me in the puffy parka I'd been meaning to replace for 3 winters. He asked if the train to Toronto was still delayed. I said yes. He said something dry and funny about Via Rail and Canadian winters that made me laugh out loud in a way that startled even me. We talked for 2 hours on the platform. Then we talked for another 4 on the train. By the time we pulled into Union Station, he had my number, and I had the strange, dazed feeling of someone who has accidentally walked into something much bigger than she bargained for. Owen was 32, the second son of a family that had built a private equity firm, over 40 years, into something that touched nearly every major real estate development in Ontario. The Voss name was on buildings in Toronto's financial district, on the donor walls of hospitals, on the chairs of charitable foundations. They weren't celebrities. They were the quieter, more permanent kind of powerful, the kind that doesn't need to be photographed, that shows up at the right galas and the right boardrooms and is simply understood to matter. Owen himself was not what I expected from all of that. He was warm. He remembered small things, that I'd mentioned my sister's name once and asked about her the next time we spoke, that I'd said I loved Vietnamese food, and showed up on our 3rd date with 3 different faux broths he'd picked up from a place on Spadina because he couldn't remember which one I'd said I liked. He was thoughtful in the specific, careful way that makes you feel seen rather than studied. We dated for 7 months before he brought me to meet his family. 7 months. Which should tell you something. Owen wasn't slow about other things. He told me early that he was serious about me. He said it plainly, without performance, the way he said most things. But the family introduction, that he was careful about, he mentioned once that it was a lot, and then seemed to decide that was all he needed to say about it. I found out why in increments. His father, Edmund Voss, had come to Canada from Germany in the 1980s, with a business degree, and enough ambition to build something from nothing. He had the particular authority of men who have made themselves, the kind that doesn't ask permission and doesn't explain itself. His mother, Anne, was from old Ontario money, the Westmount-adjacent kind of cultivated polish that wears tasteful jewelry to Sunday lunch and asks questions that sound like conversation but are actually evaluations. And then there was Rowan. Owen mentioned Rowan to me exactly twice in 7 months. Once, casually, as my brother, when explaining why he couldn't make a weekend trip. Once more, when I asked directly, and he said, "We're not close," in a tone that closed a door. I didn't push. I figured every family had a complicated thread. I had a cousin I hadn't spoken to in 4 years over something that started as a disagreement about a wedding seating chart and became something larger and uglier. I understood that siblings could be a chapter of your life that you kept mostly closed. What I didn't understand, what I had no framework for, was Rowan Voss. I met him the same night I met the rest of the family, at a dinner in their home near Rosedale, one of those old Toronto houses that sits back from the street behind a stand of mature maples, that has proper window trim and original hardwood, and the particular hush of rooms that have always had money in them. It was late October. There were 8 of us at the table. Owen's parents, 2 of his sisters and their husbands, Owen, me, and Rowan. I noticed him the moment I walked in, and I want to be honest about that too, because honesty is the only thing I can offer now. He was standing near the fireplace with a glass of something amber in his hand. not speaking to anyone. Just watching the room with the particular ease of someone who is entirely comfortable being the most dangerous person's presence. He was taller than Owen by a few centimeters and broader through the shoulders. He had Owen's dark eyes but wore them differently. Less warmth, more edge. Where Owen looked at you like he was genuinely interested, Rowan looked at you like he was deciding something. Owen introduced me to everyone quickly, the practiced efficiency of a man who had brought dates to family dinners before and knew the choreography. His parents were cordial. His sisters were warm, curious about me in the way that told me they liked their brother and were cautiously hopeful. And then Owen steered me toward the fireplace and said, "And this is Rowan." Rowan looked at me for a moment before he extended his hand, not rudely, just long enough to register. "Iris," he said, and it wasn't a question. He'd been told my name clearly, but he said it like he was testing how it sounded. "Mr. Voss," I said. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, more the ghost of one, the hint that a smile was possible but he hadn't committed to it yet. "Rowan," he said. That was essentially all we said to each other that night. He sat at the far end of the table. He spoke to his father about something to do with a development project in Mississauga that seemed to create a low-level charge in the air between them. Not quite argument, not quite agreement. He glanced at me twice during dinner, in a way I couldn't interpret and chose not to think about. Owen squeezed my hand under the table at one point and said quietly, "You're doing great." I pressed his hand back and tried to believe him. The second dinner was in December, a larger gathering. A holiday party, really, 40 or 50 people in the same Rosedale house, catered, with the particular warmth of Christmas lights and good wine, and everyone performing the comfortable version of themselves that December demands. Owen and I had been together 9 months by then. Things between us were good, more than good. They were solid, and solid was something I had learned to value more than fireworks. Owen and I fit together in the practical, daily sense. We cooked dinner together on Sundays. He kept his own place in Liberty Village but had a drawer at mine. We had the kind of easy, familiar humor that builds up between people who have been paying attention to each other for months. I was happy. I want to make that clear. I was genuinely, uncomplicatedly happy. I arrived at the party with Owen, but lost him fairly quickly to a cluster of his father's business associates who wanted to talk about interest rates and the commercial real estate market in ways that required Owen and did not require me. His sister Clara found me and stayed close for a while, which I was grateful for, and then her husband needed her, and I was alone with my wine near one of the tall windows that looked out onto the snow-covered garden. It was the kind of party where you don't feel lonely being alone. There was enough warmth in the room, enough noise, enough the sense of occasion. I was content, watching the lights in the garden, letting the party move around me. I felt a hand on my arm, fingers wrapping just above my elbow, the familiar weight of it, the specific way Owen touched me when he was reclaiming me gently from a crowd. I turned without thinking. I leaned up. I kissed him. I kissed him the way you kiss someone you've been kissing for 9 months. Not tentatively, not as a greeting, but with the full warmth of familiarity, with the comfort of someone you trust completely. And then I opened my eyes. The air went out of the room. It wasn't Owen. Rowan was looking down at me with an expression I will probably spend the rest of my life trying to categorize. Stillness, mostly, but underneath it, something lit. Something that I recognized even then, even in the first shocked second, even though I desperately did not want to recognize it. He hadn't moved. He hadn't stepped back. He hadn't said anything. I stepped back. I felt the blood drain from my face and then flood back in, hot and terrible. "I'm so sorry," I said. My voice came out strange, thin, too high. "I thought you were. I'm so sorry I didn't." "I know," he said, very quiet. "I thought you were Owen." "I know," he said again. Same quiet, same perfect stillness. And then, because the universe apparently needed to be maximally cruel, I heard Owen's voice from somewhere behind me. Easy and warm, "There you are. I've been looking for." He stopped. I turned around. Owen was standing 5 feet away with 2 glasses of wine, and his face had the particular quality of a person who has just understood something that has rearranged the world slightly. He looked at me. He looked at Rowan. He looked at me again. "It was an accident," I said immediately. "Owen, I turned around and I thought it was you. I didn't know." "Okay," Owen said. But the word came out flat, in a way that okay never came out from Owen. And I knew, with the sick certainty of someone who understands what they've done, that the 9 months of Sunday dinners and easy laughter and the drawer in my apartment were suddenly on a different kind of footing. He didn't end it that night. He was too measured for that, too careful. We drove home without speaking much. He kissed me at my door and said he'd call me tomorrow, and he did, and we talked, and I explained again. The hand on my arm, the assumption, the half-second of not looking, and he listened, and he said he understood. And I believe he did understand. I also believe it didn't matter whether he understood or not, because understanding isn't the same as being okay with something, and Owen, for all his warmth, was a person with a long memory and a quiet kind of pride. Things between us changed after that. Not dramatically. He didn't become cold, he didn't withdraw love, he didn't say anything unkind, but the easy unself-consciousness we'd had together developed a small, hard knot that I could feel when I reached for his hand and found it a half-second slower to respond. That I could feel in the slight distance that appeared between us in rooms. The way he'd stopped pulling me into conversations with his father's associates and had started letting me navigate those introductions on my own. It took until February, a full year, almost to the week, from the Tuesday train platform, for him to say the thing he'd been building toward. We were at my kitchen table, and he was kind about it. Owen was always kind. He said he thought we wanted different things, long-term. He said he thought he'd been more certain about where we were heading than maybe the facts warranted. He said, and this is the part I think about, that he'd been doing a lot of thinking since December. He didn't mention Rowan. He didn't have to. I didn't argue. I didn't cry until after he'd gone. And then I sat on the kitchen floor, with my back against the cabinets, and cried for an hour in the dark, not entirely sure what I was crying for Owen, or for the version of my life that had felt so solid and turned out to have been sitting on a fault line I hadn't known was there. I didn't see Rowan for 3 months after that. I wasn't avoiding him, specifically. I was avoiding the whole Voss-shaped part of my life, which had contracted sharply and immediately back to its original size. Just mine, just Ottawa, just the routines and the friends, and the work that had always been there. I threw myself back into things. I was a landscape architect at a firm in Ottawa that worked mostly on public green space projects, parks, trail corridors, the greening of institutional campuses. It was work I loved, concrete and seasonal and grounding in the literal sense. In March I took on a new project, a trail restoration initiative in Gatineau Park, and I hiked out to the site twice a week through the last of the snow, making notes, breathing cold air, trying to remember that I was a person with a good life. It mostly worked. And then, on a Thursday in May, I was coming out of a coffee shop on Elgin Street in Ottawa with a large dark roast and the particular morning distraction of having forgotten my umbrella, when it was clearly going to rain, and I walked directly into someone coming in the opposite direction. The coffee went first, then my notebook, then my dignity. Sorry, I'm so. I started and looked up. Rowan Voss looked down at me with the same watchful stillness he'd had the first time I saw him, in the Rosedale house by the fireplace. He was in Ottawa, which registered as strange because I'd never thought of him as someone who existed outside of Toronto, in a dark jacket and no tie, and he had coffee on his sleeve, and his expression was exactly as unreadable as it had always been. Iris, he said. What are you doing in Ottawa? I said before I could stop myself. Meeting, he said. Right. I crouched down to pick up my notebook. He crouched at the same time and we nearly knocked heads, and then we were both crouching on the sidewalk on Elgin Street in a light rain, and it was so profoundly absurd that I laughed. A real laugh. Surprised out of me. He looked at me when I laughed. That same assessment. Let me buy you another coffee, he said. I should have said no. I had been constructing reasons to say no for 3 months without even knowing I was doing it, but the rain was starting, and I had no umbrella, and my notebook was damp, and I was tired suddenly of the architecture of avoidance. Okay, I said. We sat for an hour. He wasn't what I'd expected, one-on-one. At the family dinners he had been quiet in a way that felt like choice, like someone who has decided that most conversation isn't worth participating in. Alone with me, he was different, still careful, still watchful. But he asked questions and actually listened to the answers, and he had a dry, understated way of talking about things that occasionally surfaced into something genuinely funny. He asked about my work. I told him about the Gatineau project. He knew more about environmental policy than I'd expected, and had sharp, specific questions about ecological corridors and urban heat that made me talk more than I'd intended to. "You're surprised I know anything about this," he said. I didn't say that. "You had the face," he said. "What face?" "The face people have when they realize I might be more than a man in a suit who moves money around." I didn't say anything to that. He was right. That was exactly the face I'd had. "I did a degree in environmental studies before the MBA," he said without defensiveness, just offering it. I wanted to do something different. Then my father got sick and I came back to help run the firm. And then it became this. He didn't say what this was. He didn't have to. We were quiet for a moment in the comfortable, uncomplicated way of two people who don't need to fill silence. Then he said, without preamble, "Owen is seeing someone." I put my coffee down. "Oh, I thought you should hear it from someone who wasn't going to deliver it like news." I sat with that for a moment. It hurt, but it was the clean, survivable kind of hurt. The kind that tells you you're mostly already through something. "How long?" I asked. "Not long," I nodded. "Good. I hope it's good for him." Rowan looked at me like he was deciding something again, that particular quality of his attention. "You mean that?" he said. "Of course I mean it. Most people don't." "I'm not most people," I said, and it came out more direct than I'd intended, but I didn't take it back. Something moved in his face. Not the ghost of a smile this time, a real one, brief and contained, like sunlight through a gap in cloud. "No," he said. "I know." He texted me 3 days later. A question about a paper I'd mentioned, an academic thing about riparian buffer zones, and whether I'd recommend it. I answered, he responded. It became a thread. The thread became a habit. I told myself it was nothing. He lived in Toronto. I lived in Ottawa. He was Owen's brother. There were 100 reasons why whatever this was, whatever this quiet, sidewalk-built thing was a bad idea of some significant magnitude. I catalogued them regularly. I was thorough about it. And then in July he drove up to Ottawa on a Friday evening and texted to say he was at a restaurant on Murray Street and asked if I wanted dinner. I stared at my phone for a long time. Then I put on better shoes and went. We had dinner for 3 hours. The kind where neither of you checks your phone and the waiter has to come back 4 times before you actually order dessert. He told me about growing up as the oldest son of a man who'd built something from nothing and the particular weight of that inheritance. Not the money, but the expectation, the feeling of being shaped toward a thing before you were old enough to know whether you wanted it. I told him about the way I'd spent my 20s being careful, building a life that looked right from the outside, and the growing suspicion that careful wasn't the same as right. Is that why you're a landscape architect? He asked. I thought about it. Maybe. You're outside. Things grow or they don't, but either way you understand why. He was quiet in the way that meant he was actually absorbing it. I like that, he said. We walked down to the canal afterward. It was warm and the sky was still light at 9 p.m., the way it gets in July in Ottawa, that long golden suspension of dusk. He walked beside me close enough that our arms brushed and neither of us moved away. At the corner where I needed to turn toward my apartment, we stopped. He looked at me for a long moment. This is complicated, I said. Yes, he said. Owen is not part of this, Rowan said. Not unkindly, but firmly. What Owen and I are, that's old and it belongs to us and neither of us can borrow it to make a decision about something else. That's easy to say, I know. We stood there a moment longer, the canal quiet behind us. I'll drive back tonight, he said. I'm not asking for anything, Iris. I just wanted to have dinner with you. I believed him. That was the thing. I believed him. He had never once performed toward me. From the first dinner in Rosedale to the coffee on the sidewalk to tonight, Rowan Voss had always been exactly what he was, and what he was happened to be someone I was finding it increasingly hard to look away from. Come back next Friday, I said. He didn't smile the way someone would in a movie, big and certain. He just looked at me with that quiet attention and said, Okay. He came back the next Friday, and the one after that. By August we had stopped pretending it was anything other than what it was. He called me Birch. I still don't know entirely why. Some combination of a tree analogy he'd made early on and the way I'd laughed at it, and it had quietly become the only name that sounded like him saying my name. I was happy in a way that felt different from the happiness I'd had with Owen. That happiness had been comfortable, warm, a good fit. This was less comfortable and more true, like the difference between a room where everything matches and a room where everything is yours. I knew what was coming. I'd been delaying it in my head for months, the way you delay looking at a difficult thing by keeping busy on all sides of it. I needed to tell Owen. Not ask permission. I wasn't under any illusion that I owed Owen my decisions. But Owen had been honest with me and kind when he hadn't been required to be, and I owed him the basic respect of not having him hear it from someone else at Christmas dinner. I called him on a Sunday in September. He picked up after 2 rings. I said I needed to tell him something, and I told him. There was a silence on the line. How long, he asked, his voice was even, since July. But it was building before that. Since May, another silence. I see, he said. I waited. I didn't fill the silence with apology or explanation, because I'd used all my explanations in February and they hadn't helped then either. Is he good to you? Owen asked finally. The question surprised me. Yes, I said. Okay, Owen breathed out slowly. I can't. I'm not going to say it doesn't matter or that it's fine. It isn't fine. But you're both adults and I can't tell either of you how to live. I know I'm going to need some time, he said. Before I'm at a table with both of you. Of course. However long you need. There was a pause. Then, very quietly, did it that night in December. Was that the first time you? No, I said. I didn't know what I felt until well after Owen. What happened in December was exactly what I told you it was. I turned around and thought you were you. Another silence. Then, wearily, I know, I always knew that. I think I was looking for a reason to make it simpler. I know, I said softly. We stayed on the line a little longer. Not quite warmly, but not coldly either. Then we said goodbye. I sat on my couch for a while after and felt the strange weight of something settling. Not resolution, exactly. More like the acknowledgement of consequence. The recognition that choices have ripples. That you can act with honesty and still cause hurt. And that neither of those facts cancels the other out. The first Voss family event where Rowan and I were both present as a couple was the following spring. His sister Clara's wedding, a Saturday in April at a vineyard in Niagara-on-the-Lake. The kind of day Ontario does very well. Pale gray sky in the morning burning off to clean blue, the vines still bare and the lake visible in the distance, everything smelling like water and cold air, and the beginning of things. Owen was there. Of course he was. It was his sister's wedding. I had been anxious about it in the weeks leading up, the low-grade anxiety of someone who has rehearsed a difficult scene too many times. Rowan didn't tell me not to worry. He just put his hand at the small of my back when we walked in and left it there long enough for me to remember that I wasn't doing this alone. Owen was across the room. He saw us. His eyes moved from me to Rowan and back, and then he did something that made me take a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. He nodded. Small and contained and without warmth but without hostility either. He turned back to the person he'd been speaking to. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't approval. It was something smaller and more honest. A person deciding to be in the same room as a situation they hadn't chosen, and behaving with the dignity that I had always known Owen was capable of. Later, near the end of the evening, I found myself briefly alone by the windows that looked out over the vineyard. The sky was going pink at the edges. Somewhere behind me, the music had shifted to something slow. I felt Rowan before I heard him. His warmth beside me, the particular gravity of him. Birch, he said quietly. You okay? I thought about it honestly, which is the only way I know how to answer that question. Yeah, I said. I think so. He stood beside me and looked out at the vineyard, the long rows and the pink sky and the lake somewhere beyond it. His hand found mine without ceremony, the way it always did. Not with performance, just with sureness. I had walked into the Voss family on a December night, with someone else's history and someone else's warmth, and I had stumbled into a moment I couldn't explain, and I had spent months trying to understand whether the stumble was the thing, or whether the thing was something that had been building all along, and only needed a stumble to surface. I don't have a clean answer to that. I'm not sure I ever will. What I have is this. A Sunday morning in Ottawa with coffee and CBC radio, and Rowan on my couch, reading a policy brief with his glasses on, which he hates being caught wearing. A drawer in my apartment that has been replaced by half a closet. A project in Gatineau that I'm still working on. That will take years. That involves planting trees I will never see fully grown. What I have is complicated and real and mine. There's a word for that in some languages. The Japanese have mono no aware, the kind of beauty that is inseparable from its impermanence, the ache of things that matter precisely because they could be otherwise. I don't have a word for it in English, but I know what it feels like. It feels like standing in a vineyard in April with someone's hand in yours, watching the sky go from pink to dark, not saying anything, not needing to. It feels like enough.